Are you a beginning photographer and have been hearing the term exposure triangle? You don't know what it is, or you're not sure how everything works? Well, stay tuned. We're going to jump right into that. Okay, the exposure triangle. It's made up of aperture, or sometimes it's referred to as f-stop, your shutter speed, and your ISO. Now, I'm not going to go into the very specific technical side of stuff because I'm a beginner just like you. I'm going to explain it to you the way I understand it, and hopefully that will help you to decide how better to take your photographs as well. Let's start with aperture, because I think aperture is the most tricky of the bunch. The bigger the number, the smaller the opening, which means the smaller the number, the bigger the opening, and it lets more light through. But there's a side effect of opening your lens all the way up. It changes how much is in focus as well. If you think of your the photo you're trying to take, think of it as a long tube. So if your aperture, let's blah, 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 blah. Okay, if you think of the picture you're trying to take as a long tube, if your aperture has a high number, which means you're letting it, the opening is small and you're letting a less amount of light through, you can get the entire tube into focus. But if you're running your aperture wide open, you'll get thinner slices of that tube in focus. And depending on how wide your lens goes, the one I'm shooting on right now is the Sigma 30mm 1.4, which means I can go all the way down to a 1.4 aperture, and that means I get a very thin slice of that tube in focus. And I've got some examples of everything I'm talking about. We'll jump into Lightroom after I'm done with this short explanation. So that's the way I think of it, is just the tube with how big of a slice do I want to get in focus, as well as how much light it's letting in to hit the sensor. Now, if you want the very technical details of how this all works, I'm not the guy to ask, but I'm going to leave you a link at the end of this video to one of my favorite YouTubers that's very technical on this stuff and so smart about stuff, Gerald Undone. If you're watching a photography video, you've probably heard of Gerald Undone, but just in case you haven't, I'm going to leave a link to his channel on the end screen and down below, so make sure you go check out Gerald Undone because he is fantastic with explaining these things. But, because like the aperture, the f2 on my lens might not be the same as the f2 on your lens, because it's actually a very complicated equation that has to do with how big the lens is, there's all sorts of stuff that he goes into. So he's much better to explain stuff like that. All I want you to understand today is that the bigger your aperture, the more light it lets in, but you get a thinner slice. And bigger aperture is actually the smaller f-stop numbers. Okay, let's move on along to shutter speed. Shutter speed is very simple. It's how quickly the shutter opens and closes, letting a certain amount of light in. Now, a couple of things to consider while playing with your shutter speed is if you have anything that's going to be moving in your photo. And I took a couple shots of my hand in front of the camera moving up and down. So, the faster the shutter is, the more it freezes the action. So if you've got a really slow shutter speed because you're in a darker place and you're trying to let more light in, you need to be aware that anything that might move in your photo is going to end up getting blurry. And blurry might be something you're going for. There are actually a couple of shots, I don't have any to show you, but if you search for them online, they're out there. You can actually do a long exposure, which means you're leaving your shutter open for an extended period of time. In, like, say, Times Square, The buildings are not moving. Excuse me. The buildings in Times Square aren't moving, but all of the people that are walking around in Times Square are moving. So you can actually take a long exposure to the point where all of the people will blur out. You won't actually see any of the people. If you hit it just right with the right amount of light, you can make it look like there's nobody there. You're probably going to have a little bit of blur here and there, but you can clean that blur out with Lightroom or Photoshop and really come up with some cool pictures. So it all depends on how you want to go about shaping your picture. So the two things that we've talked about so far are aperture and shutter speed. That's two sides of the triangle. And those are the two things that you can really use to design what you want to do with the photo, whether you want to try and make the water freeze in a waterfall, or you want to get some motion through it so that you just see a little bit of motion in the water, or you can go even longer and get that silky smooth water effect that so many people seem to like. I'm not a huge fan of those myself, but a lot of people like them, so it's worth exploring. So you just have to keep in mind how quick your shutter is opening and closing, as well as how big of a slice of what you're looking at you're going to actually get in focus by how big you have your aperture in. And like I said, these are the two most complicated things to figure out. And you just have to get out there with your camera and play with it. Try all different sorts of settings. I know that big M on your camera dial, the manual mode, is so scary. But what I did when I was first starting is I put it in manual mode, but then left the ISO in auto. So that was one of the three things I didn't have to worry about. And then I could just shape my pictures with the aperture and the shutter speed. Now let's go ahead and talk about ISO. ISO, I don't even know what it stands for. It's the sensitivity of your sensor to light. So at 100, it's not as sensitive, so you can blast a lot more light into it and it'll get a good clear image. If it's in darker environments, the ISO needs to go up. How far you can go up depends entirely on your camera. I'm shooting on a Sony a6400, so I have my ISO capped at 6400. I don't want it to go any higher than that because at 6400 I'll get a little bit of noise, but not too much. I think the pictures will still look good. It can go much higher than that. And some cameras, like some big full frame cameras, can take an even higher ISO and not show any noise. Hopefully, I won't know until I get down into Lightroom with the pictures I've got on my camera right now. Hopefully I got a little bit of noise so I can show you what that looks like. But if you think of it as grain from the old film photography days, it's the same kind of a look, but now because we're all digital, it's digital noise. It's spots where shooting like my black shirt in really low light with a high ISO, it won't actually capture the black because it'll be too dark and you'll end up with this like spotty look to it. And that's what grain or noise is. So again, you're just going to have to play with your camera because every camera is different. Ideally, we could shoot everything at 50 or 100 ISO depending on how low your camera goes, but not all cameras have that ability, and we're not always in the very best lighting conditions. Like here in my dining room, the lighting's not great. I have to add quite a bit of light. There's a light behind me, there's a light over here to the side, there's a light up there, and my overhead light is up there. So I have quite a bit of light in here. And it's still a little dark because I don't actually own any real photography lights yet. I'm working on it. I'm going to get a kit real soon, and hopefully that improves things. But I don't have any of that stuff yet, so we'll just have to make do with what we got. And I've got some natural light coming in from the kitchen window over there. So anyway, that's the three sides of the exposure triangle. And now let's jump into Lightroom. I'll show you these pictures I've got, and we'll look at them real close very briefly so that we can see what's going on. Okay, let's start here, working backwards with the ISO. This is what the picture initially started like. Of course, that all that blue is Lightroom telling me what all is underexposed. You can see up here in the upper right-hand corner on the histogram, the blacks are all crushed up here. But after a little bit of editing, it came to this. Now let's go ahead and bring the blacks up a little more so there's not any of that. See how it's still leaving the... See these blue markers in through there? That tells you where there's absolutely nothing that has been recorded in the dark areas. But see how it has this kind of grainy look here to all the wood? That's noise, but of course this is an exaggerated example because the ISO I had turned up all the way to 6400, and again the picture was really, really dark to start with. Go ahead and hit a little autocorrect on that. See, this is how everything that's blue there had almost no data to work with, and I wouldn't try to take a picture with it that dark, with the ISO up that high, because you can see this just does not look very good at all. But then you move on down here into a little bit more light. We can bring the blacks up a little bit. And now you can see that it must have grabbed focus over here because that's what's in focus, and the rest of it is still kind of blurry. So let's back up over here. This is shot at f1.4. So you can see here that thin slice I was talking about. This dragon figure, yes, I'm an old D&D geek. I have lots and lots of D&D figurines, and there's a 20-sided die. But you can see how the die is a little on the blurry side. This dragon is in focus, and because this ogre is on almost the same plane, he's a lot more in focus than any of the other stuff. And you can see the further away you get from the focus point when you're wide open at f1.4 or 1.2, the blurrier it gets. You can almost not even recognize those chairs along the back of my table as chairs. But then this picture, I believe, let me see if I can find how I look up here. You can see here that this was at, I think I turned it up, the camera up to f5.6 at that point. So while the die is not exactly in focus, because I know I focused on my main dragon figurine here, all of the things around him are in focus, but the stuff up here is not. And then we go on to, I believe I turned it all the way up to I think it went all the way up to F8 or F9. But you can see, I might have even gone even further than that, but you can see here, pretty much everything is in focus. So those are the slices I was talking about. I had to lower my shutter speed to get more light in to keep the exposure right. And I still had the ISO on auto at this point. But you can see here that because I've narrowed the aperture down or taken a larger f-stop number, that more of that cylinder is in focus. Now the blur I was talking about with your shutter speed, here's a picture of my hand taken on a very slow shutter speed. You can see that it's sort of my hand, but it's mostly blurry because it came through the frame. But see how you can start to see the objects behind it through my fingers, how they kind of become translucent? That's what I was talking about. If you slow your shutter speed way, way down, you can actually make the moving things in your picture disappear completely. And now here is a picture where, of course, the camera grabbed focus on my hand because it's a Sony a6400 with a really fast
Sigma lens on it, but I was actually moving my hand there through the frame, but I had the shutter speed set high enough that it froze the action. Now, of course, depending on how fast of a thing you're taking a picture of, you'll have to turn your shutter speed up even faster if you want to freeze the action. My hand doesn't move very fast, but if you're trying to catch, say, LeBron James or Usain Bolt, a world-class athlete moving fast, you're going to have a pretty high shutter speed to catch them and freeze frame. Just like if you're taking a waterfall picture, the water's coming down off that thing pretty fast. If you want to freeze the water droplets in the air, you got to have a real high shutter speed. So because your shutter speed is going to be so high, and it's only going to be open for just a very tiny fraction of a second, you have to make sure that you're still getting enough light in the camera to take the picture. So you might have to turn your ISO up, and you might have to open your aperture way up. So that's just one of those things you're going to have to play with. But those are the examples. Let's see what else I took here. Yeah, there's another picture with a high. I think I went back to about a 5 on this one, 5.6 or so, because a good chunk of this is in focus, but as you get off of the dragon, it starts to blur off a little bit. And there's another one. There's still a lot of editing to do to these photos if I was going to photo them up and actually get them ready to use for anything. But these were just example photos today.
I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, hit the like, hit the share. If you didn't get anything useful out of this, go ahead and hit the dislike button twice to let people know you didn't really care for this video. Hopefully the weather squares up soon so I can actually get back outside and go do something. But we'll see how it goes. This is February in Nebraska, and the possibility of having any really good weather is not great. But we'll see what happens. I hope you all have a great day. Don't forget to hit the check this button over here to look up Gerald Undone. Hit my subscribe button over here. And I hope you all have a great day. We'll see you in the next one.